The universe had always been vast, cold, indifferent. But for the first time in 3 centuries, it was about to witness something extraordinary. Something that would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization and remind every species from the core worlds to the outer rim of a single terrifying truth. Never underestimate a cornered human. Earth was nothing more than a memory, a blue marble that existed only in the encrypted data cores of a few surviving humans scattered across 47 mining colonies, 14 agricultural worlds, and countless industrial stations. The planet itself had been strip-mined into a hollow shell, its resources feeding the endless hunger of the Jacari Empire for nearly 300 years. The Jacari, six-limbed arthropods, whose chitinous exoskeletons gleamed like polished obsidian under the harsh lights of their industrial complexes. They stood 9 feet tall when fully extended, their primary arms ending in razor-sharp mandibles capable of cutting through steel, while their secondary appendages manipulated tools with unsettling precision. But it wasn't their physical prowess that had conquered half the galaxy, it was their complete lack of empathy. To the Jikari, every other species existed for one purpose: labor. High Dominarch Six Thura stood on the observation deck of mining station Tertius 7, her compound eyes scanning the endless procession of human workers below. They moved in perfect synchronization, their movements dictated by the neural inhibitors grafted to their spinal columns at birth. Each device, no larger than a credit chip, ensured absolute compliance through a carefully calibrated mixture of pain and reward. The human quotas are exceeding projections by 12%, reported Subdominarch Cralvin, his vocal apparatus producing the characteristic clicking sounds of satisfied Jacari bureaucracy. Their physical endurance continues to surprise our xenobiologists. Zixthera's mandibles twitched, the equivalent of a human smile, though infinitely more predatory. Humans are remarkable creatures. Cralvin, they can survive in environments that would kill most species. They require minimal nutrition. They breed quickly. And most importantly, she gestured toward the mining floor where a human had just collapsed from exhaustion, only to be immediately replaced by another. They never truly break. Never break, Dominarch. Observe. Serve. Activated the viewing screen, zooming in on a particular section of the mining floor. Unit designation Delta 7739. Human male, approximately 35 standard years, has been operating heavy extraction equipment for the past 18 months without a single violation. The human in question was unremarkable by most standards. Average height, lean from inadequate nutrition, dark hair cropped short for hygiene purposes. But Zixifora had learned to read the subtle signs that her fellow Zikari missed. The way his shoulders remained straight despite exhaustion, the careful precision with which he maintained his equipment, the almost imperceptible glances he exchanged with other workers. What do you see, Cralvin? The Subdominarch studied the human for several moments. Compliance. Efficiency. Standard operational parameters. You see the surface. I see the storm beneath. Zixthara's secondary arms manipulated the controls, bringing up a detailed psychological profile. This human's cortisol levels remain elevated, despite neural suppression. His sleep patterns indicate active dreaming forbidden by protocol. And most tellingly, his productivity increases whenever he's placed near other humans from his original colony group. Should we redistribute him? No. The word emerged as a sharp click. We watch. We learn. And when the time comes, her compound eyes fixed on the human called Delta 7739, we remind them why the Zakari rule the galaxy. 3 levels below, in the suffocating heat of the extraction tunnels, Delta 7739, who still thought of himself as James Chen whenever the neural inhibitor's grip loosened, paused in his work for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to wipe imaginary sweat from his brow, long enough to meet the eyes of the woman operating the conveyor controls 20 meters away. Her designation was Epsilon 24-1, but James remembered when she'd been called Commander Lisa Park of the Earth Defense Corps. Before the surrender, before the processing centers, before they'd all become numbers in the vast machinery of Jekari industry. 3 seconds. Just enough time for Lisa to tap her finger against the control panel in a specific pattern. 3 short taps, 2 long, 3 short again. Essos. The message wasn't directed at James. It was meant for the 17 other former Earth defense personnel scattered throughout the mining complex, each one carefully positioned through months of calculated shift requests and minor infractions that had resulted in reassignments, each one maintaining the facade of broken compliance while something far more dangerous grew in the shadows. James returned to his work, the massive extraction drill humming as it bit into the asteroid's core. Rare Earth elements and exotic minerals flowed up through the collection tubes, destined to fuel the Zurkari war machine. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, a different kind of extraction would take place. The shift change alarm echoed through the tunnels at 2:30 hours, its piercing wail driving the workers toward their dormitory blocks like cattle. James moved with the crowd, his neural inhibitor ensuring that his pace remained steady, unremarkable. But his mind, the part of his mind that the inhibitor couldn't quite reach, was racing. Dormitory Block 7 was identical to every other human housing unit in the Zurkari Empire. 200 sleeping pods arranged in perfect rows, each one barely large enough for a human body. The air recycling system wheezed constantly, providing just enough oxygen to maintain consciousness. Privacy was a concept that had died with Earth. James settled into Pod 47B and waited. The dormitory lights dimmed to their overnight setting, bathing everything in a sickly green glow designed to disrupt human circadian rhythms. Around him, 200 souls tried to find peace in a universe that had forgotten their names. At 0347 hours, when the Zurkari guards were at their least attentive, James felt a gentle tap on his pod wall. 1 tap, pause. 3 taps, pause. 5 taps. 1, 3, 5. The Fibonacci sequence. A signal so subtly embedded in the normal sounds of the dormitory that only someone looking for it would notice. James responded with the next number in the sequence, 8 taps, and waited. From Pod 52A came 13 taps, then 21 from Pod 38D, then 34 from Pod 61C. One by one, 17 former Earth defense personnel confirmed their readiness. At 0352 hours, a maintenance hatch in the floor of Dormitory Block 7 opened with the softest whisper of escaping air. Lisa Park, Epsilon 24th1, emerged like a ghost, moving with the fluid precision that had once made her the youngest commander in Earth defense history. 5 minutes, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise. Chen, Rodriguez, Nakamura, you're with me, Petrov. Maintain overwatch? Everyone else knows their positions. James slipped from his pod, his body moving automatically while his mind marveled at the impossible. They were actually doing this. After 3 years of careful planning, of hidden conversations conducted in maintenance codes and supply requisitions, of slowly gathering the tools and knowledge they would need. Where? He asked. Lisa's eyes were hard as steel. Storage Bay 7. We've got 40 minutes before the next guard rotation. They moved through the maintenance tunnels like shadows, following routes that Lisa had memorized during her months working in facility maintenance. The Zurkari had made one crucial error in their psychological profiles. They assumed that broken humans would remain broken. They couldn't conceive of hope as anything other than a weakness to be eliminated. Storage Bay 7 contained everything a small group of desperate humans could need: emergency oxygen canisters, maintenance tools, portable power cells, and most importantly, access to the station's communication array. But as they approached the bay's entrance, James felt the first stirring of unease. Lisa, he whispered. She was already reaching for her multi-tool when the lights blazed to life. Unit designations Delta 7739 and Epsilon 2441 came the familiar clicking voice of Subdominar Kralvin. Please remain stationary. The bay was filled with Zurkari guards, a dozen of them, their exoskeletons gleaming under the harsh illumination. Behind them stood High Dominarch Sikthara herself, her compound eyes reflecting the light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Did you truly believe, she said, her translator rendering her clicks and whistles into cold, precise English, that we were unaware of your activities? Lisa's hand was still moving toward her tool when the neural inhibitor activated. James felt it too, a spike of agony that drove every conscious thought from his mind, leaving only the mechanical compliance that had defined the last 3 years of his existence. The neural inhibitors are truly remarkable devices, Zixthera continued, stepping closer. They don't simply suppress rebellion. They make it physically impossible. The pain centers of your brain are now flooded with signals so intense that any deviation from compliance becomes literally unthinkable. James tried to speak, tried to move, tried to do anything other than stand motionless while his dreams crumbled around him. But his body belonged to the inhibitor now, and the inhibitor belonged to the Strikari. However, Sitgather said, her mandibles spreading in that terrible approximation of a smile, we are not without appreciation for human ingenuity. Your resistance cell identified 17 individuals across 3 work shifts. You developed a communications system using mathematical sequences. You located this storage facility and planned what I assume was intended to be a transmission to other colonies. She gestured, and one of the guards activated a holographic display showing a star map. Dozens of points pulsed with soft red light: mining colonies, agricultural worlds, industrial stations. What you could not know, Zaxithara continued, is that similar resistance cells have emerged on 43 other installations across the past 6 months, all following remarkably similar patterns, all believing themselves to be unique in their defiance. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. They weren't alone. Across the galaxy, humans were remembering who they had been, remembering that they were more than numbers in a Zongari database. This presents us with an interesting dilemma, the High Dominarch mused. We could simply execute all known resistance members and implement more stringent controls. But that would be wasteful. Humans are, as I mentioned, remarkably useful creatures. She approached Lisa, studying her with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. Instead, we have decided to conduct an experiment, a demonstration, if you will, of why the Skari Empire will endure for another 1,000 years. The guards were moving now, forming a circle around the captured humans. James could see weapons being drawn, not the energy rifles used for crowd control, but surgical instruments, precise tools designed for maximum pain and minimum lethality. Your resistance cells will be allowed to continue their activities, Zuktura announced. But with one crucial modification: every successful act of rebellion, every sabotaged machine, every intercepted communication, every attempt at escape will result in the death of 10 random humans from this facility. The neural inhibitor's grip loosened just enough for James to speak. You can't what, Delta 7739? This is precisely what we have always done. The only difference is that now you will be fully aware of the consequences of your choices. Zokstera's secondary arms manipulated a control device. Let us begin with a small demonstration. The holographic display changed, showing the interior of Dormitory Block 7. 200 humans lay in their pods, unaware that their fate was being decided in a storage bay 3 levels below. A random number generator began cycling through pod designation. For tonight's attempt at rebellion, Zythera announced, 10 humans will pay the price. The generator stopped. Pod numbers appeared on the screen: 15A, 23B, 67D, 81C, 92A, Tenzananthi 57A. Guards, execute demonstration protocol 7. James watched in horror as armed Zogari entered the dormitory block. The humans in the selected pods never woke up. Quick, efficient, merciful. Only in its brevity, 10 lives snuffed out as casually as extinguishing candles. This is the new reality, Zuktara said, as the display faded. Your choice, Delta 7739. Continue your rebellion and watch thousands die for your pride, or accept that the Zakari way is the only way. The guards released them then, the neural inhibitors resuming their standard suppression levels. James and Lisa were escorted back to their dormitory blocks as if nothing had happened. As if 10 people hadn't just died because they had dared to dream of freedom. But as James settled back into Pod 47B, as the station returned to its normal rhythm of exploitation and misery, something unexpected happened. For the first time in 3 centuries, a human smiled in the darkness. Because High Dominarch Seekthera had made a critical error. She understood human psychology well enough to predict their resistance patterns, sophisticated enough to anticipate their rebellion tactics, brilliant enough to devise the perfect deterrent. But she had never studied human history. She had never learned about a species that could look at overwhelming odds and impossible choices and somehow, inexplicably, find a third option. A species that had once brought down empires with nothing but determination and the unshakable belief that some things were worth dying for. A species that had never in all their blood-soaked history responded to terrorism by surrendering. James closed his eyes and began to count. 1, 3, 5, 8. By morning, the signal would reach every human in the facility. By the end of the week, it would spread to the other mining stations. Within a month, it would echo across 43 colonies and installations throughout Jikari space. Not a call for immediate rebellion. Not a desperate plea for rescue. Simply a message that would change everything. We remember who we are. 6 weeks after the failed escape attempt, mining station Tertius 7 operated with mechanical precision. Production quotas exceeded projections. Human compliance remained absolute. The neural inhibitors functioned flawlessly, ensuring that 20,000 workers moved through their routines without deviation, without hope, without the dangerous spark of independence that had nearly ignited into rebellion. High Dominarch Zikthara reviewed the daily reports with satisfaction. The demonstration had proven effective beyond her most optimistic projections. Not a single act of sabotage had occurred across the entire sector since the executions. The humans had learned their place, or so it appeared. 3 billion kilometers away, on the agricultural world of Harvest Prime, a very different story was unfolding. The planet's surface was a patchwork of vast farming complexes, each one stretching beyond the horizon like a green ocean. Zikari's supervisors moved through the fields on anti-gravity platforms, their compound eyes monitoring the human workers who tended the crops that fed the Empire's core worlds. In Sector 47 Delta, a human-designated Gamma 98T7 paused in her harvesting duties. To any observing Zokari, she appeared to be simply adjusting her collection bag. But embedded in that seemingly innocent motion was a mathematical sequence that had been propagating through human colonies for weeks. 1 part, 3 parts, 5 parts, 8 parts. The woman who remembered being called Dr. Amanda Foster before the neural processing continued her work with the methodical efficiency that her inhibitor demanded. But deep in her mind, in the places where even Zokari technology couldn't penetrate, equations were forming. Amanda had been a xenobiologist before the fall of Earth. She understood alien physiology in ways that most humans never would, and over the past 6 weeks, she had been conducting a very different kind of research. Not on the Zikari themselves, but on the devices they had implanted in human spines. The neural inhibitors were marvels of bioengineering, perfectly calibrated to human neurochemistry. They monitored brain activity in real time, suppressing aggressive impulses while amplifying compliance responses. They were, by any measure, flawless. But they had one weakness that their creators could never have anticipated. They had been designed by a species that thought in terms of absolute control. The Zikari mind was fundamentally hierarchical. Every thought, every decision, every action flowed through rigid command structures. They literally could not conceive of a form of intelligence that operated through distributed networks, emergent patterns, and chaotic collaboration. They could not imagine the kind of mind that would look at an impossible problem and think, what if we approach this sideways? Amanda finished her shift and made her way to the communal eating area, her movements tracked by overhead sensors that fed data directly to the facility's central intelligence. But as she passed worker designation Beta 4471, formerly Dr. Michael Chen, a computer scientist from the University of Mars, she dropped her collection bag. A simple accident. The kind of minor clumsiness that occurred dozens of times each day across the facility. As she bent to retrieve it, her fingers traced a pattern in the spilled crop seeds, prime numbers arranged in a spiral sequence. Michael saw the pattern and responded with his own accident, knocking over his water container in a specific rhythm that corresponded to the mathematical constants underlying quantum field theory. To the watching Zokari, it was just another example of human imprecision. To the growing network of scientists and engineers hidden among the workers, it was part of an increasingly complex conversation. They were building something, not a weapon. The neural inhibitors made violence impossible. Not an escape plan. Every human movement was monitored and controlled. They were constructing something far more dangerous. A new way of thinking. Back on mining station Tertius 7, James Chen had discovered that the mathematics of rebellion were more complex than anyone could have imagined. The failed storage bay incident had taught him a crucial lesson. The Jokari weren't just monitoring their actions. They were predicting them. Every pattern of resistance that humans had developed over the past 3 centuries had been catalogued, analyzed, and countered. The Empire had built its control system not just on superior technology but on a complete understanding of human psychology. But understanding and predicting were not the same thing. James had spent his pre-enslavement years as an engineer, designing quantum communication systems for the outer colonies. Now lying in Pod 47B during the enforced sleep period, he was designing something entirely different, a form of communication that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The neural inhibitors monitored conscious decision-making processes. They tracked deliberate actions and intentional communications, but they couldn't monitor the vast unconscious processes that governed human behavior, the automatic responses, the instinctive reactions, the thousands of micro-decisions that happened below the threshold of awareness. What if rebellion wasn't a choice? What if it was a reflex? The idea had come to him during a routine maintenance procedure. He'd been calibrating a mineral extractor when his hand had automatically reached for a specific tool, not because he'd consciously decided to use it, but because 20 years of engineering experience had taught his nervous system to respond automatically to certain stimuli. The neural inhibitor hadn't interfered because there had been no conscious decision to interfere with. Now James was testing the limits of that loophole. During his shifts he began incorporating tiny unconscious optimizations into his work, a slightly more efficient movement pattern here, a marginally better tool selection there, micro-adjustments that his engineering training had made instinctive, but which cumulatively began to create something unprecedented, measurably improved productivity without conscious effort. The Zakari noticed, of course, improved efficiency was always welcome, but they attributed it to the psychological effects of their demonstration. Fear, they believed, was making the humans work harder. They never suspected that fear was making the humans work smarter. Within 3 weeks, James's unconscious optimizations had spread to every human worker in his section. Production efficiency increased by 23%, while energy consumption decreased by 12%. The improvements were subtle enough to appear random, natural enough to avoid triggering security protocols, and complex enough to begin forming a pattern that no single Jekari could perceive. High Dominarch Sectic Thera first noticed the anomaly during her weekly review of sector-wide productivity reports. 17 different facilities were showing marginal but consistent efficiency improvements. Nothing dramatic. The increases fell well within normal operational variance, but the pattern was unusual. Crowthen. She clicked to her subordinate display the productivity curves for mining stations Tertius 7 through Tertius 23. The holographic charts materialized in her private office, each one showing the gradual upward trend in human output over the past month. To most observers, it would have appeared to be good news, evidence that the demonstration protocols were achieving their intended psychological effects. But Zextera had not survived 3 centuries of imperial politics by accepting surface explanations. Overlay the efficiency patterns with psychological stress indicators, she commanded. New data streams appeared on the display: cortisol levels, sleep pattern disruptions, neural inhibitor activation frequencies. According to every measurable parameter, the human workers were experiencing precisely the levels of suppressed despair that the demonstration was designed to produce. Yet productivity continued to climb. Computers, Zextera said, her mandibles clicking with growing unease, analyzed the efficiency improvements for evidence of coordinated activity. The station's artificial intelligence, a sophisticated quantum system that could process billions of variables simultaneously, ran its analysis in 0.23 seconds. No evidence of coordinated activity detected, the synthetic voice reported. All productivity improvements fall within individual worker optimization parameters. Expand analysis to include cross-facility correlation patterns. Processing. No evidence of inter-facility communication detected. All improvements appear to be independent local optimizations. Zextera stared at the data for a long moment. Her compound eyes could process visual information across 17 different spectrums simultaneously, allowing her to perceive patterns that would be invisible to most other species. But she was seeing something that shouldn't exist. Coordinated behavior without coordination. Summon the human psychological specialists, she ordered. Dr. Vector arrived within minutes, her specialized knowledge of human behavior making her invaluable to the Empire's control systems. Unlike the military castes, the Zerkari scientific classes had evolved more sophisticated communication abilities, allowing for nuanced discussion of complex topics. Dominarch, Vector buzzed respectfully. How may I assist? Explain this, Zixader said, gesturing to the productivity reports. Human efficiency is improving across multiple facilities without any evidence of communication or coordination. Dr. Vector studied the data with the focused intensity of a true scientist. Her secondary arms manipulated the holographic displays, running detailed analyses that would have taken hours for a human computer to complete. Fascinating, she concluded. The improvement patterns suggest emergent behavior. Elaborate. Human consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The neural inhibitors control deliberate decision-making processes, but they have minimal effect on instinctive responses and learned behaviors. What you're seeing appears to be the spontaneous emergence of optimized work patterns through unconscious behavioral adaptation. Zixthara's mandibles clicked sharply. Are you suggesting that the humans are evolving beyond our control mechanisms? Not evolving, adapting. It's similar to the way that school of fish can coordinate complex movements without any central control system. Each individual responds to local stimuli, but the collective behavior produces sophisticated patterns. And this is normal. Dr. Vector hesitated. Normal? No. Human behavioral adaptation typically requires conscious processing. For this level of unconscious coordination to emerge, she paused, her scientific training warring with the implications of her conclusion. It suggests that human consciousness may be more distributive than our models predict. Meaning that even with neural inhibitors suppressing individual awareness, the collective human mind may still be capable of problem-solving on a species level. The silence that followed was broken only by the ambient hum of the station's life support systems. Finally, Zub Mathura spoke. Doctor, you are describing a form of intelligence that could theoretically coordinate resistance activities below the threshold of our detection systems. Theoretically, yes. But Dominarch, the neural inhibitors make active resistance impossible. Even if humans were somehow coordinating unconsciously, they lack the ability to translate that coordination into rebellious action. Zixtara's compound eyes shifted to examine the productivity reports from a different perspective. The efficiency improvements were now approaching 30% above baseline across 14 different facility types. Whatever the humans were doing, it was accelerating. Increase surveillance on all human workers, she ordered. I want every movement, every gesture, every unconscious response monitored and analyzed. Yes, Dominarch. And Doctor? Prepare contingency protocols for sector-wide neural enhancement. If the humans are indeed operating below our detection threshold, you intend to deepen the suppression? I intend to ensure that human consciousness, individual or collective, poses no threat to imperial stability. As Dr. Vector departed to implement the new surveillance protocols, Zixtara remained alone with the holographic displays. The productivity curves continued their relentless upward climb, defying every model of human behavior that the Empire had developed. She had ruled 17 star systems for over 2 centuries. She had crushed rebellions on 43 worlds. She had reduced proud species to grateful servitude through the precise application of overwhelming force. But she had never faced an enemy that didn't know it was fighting. 6 levels below, in the cramped confines of Pod 47B, James Chen stared at the ceiling and counted prime numbers. It was a habit he'd developed during the long months of planning the failed storage bay operation, a way of keeping his mind sharp when the neural inhibitor made complex thinking impossible. But tonight the numbers seemed different. Where once he had simply counted in sequence 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, now he found himself visualizing them as geometric patterns, spirals and tessellations that extended beyond the boundaries of his pod, beyond the station itself, reaching across the vast distances between stars. He wasn't the only one experiencing these visions. Across the facility, in hundreds of sleeping pods, Human minds were unconsciously processing the same mathematical relationships. Not because they had planned to, not because they had consciously decided to coordinate their thoughts, but because somewhere in the hidden depths of human consciousness beyond the reach of Zhikari technology, a new form of intelligence was awakening. An intelligence that could think without thinking, coordinated without communicating, and solve problems that existed across light years of space. An intelligence that was about to make its first conscious decision. The neural inhibitor in James's spine registered a momentary spike in brain activity. Nothing significant enough to trigger an alert, but a pattern that would be filed away in the station's vast databases. Similar spikes were occurring throughout the facility as 20,000 humans simultaneously experienced the same impossible realization. They were no longer alone in their own minds. And in that moment of recognition, the true rebellion began. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It couldn't. The neural inhibitors were too sophisticated, the Zhikari surveillance too complete, the weight of 3 centuries of oppression too heavy to simply cast aside with a moment's inspiration. Instead, it happened the way all genuine revolutions happen. One mind at a time, one choice at a time, one tiny act of defiance that nobody notices until it's too late to stop. Dr. Amanda Foster was harvesting grain in Sector 47 Delta when she felt a sudden overwhelming sense of connection that made her stumble and nearly drop her collection bag. For a terrifying instant she thought her neural inhibitor was malfunctioning, but the sensation wasn't the sharp clinical pain of technological interference. It was warmth, recognition, the feeling of a mind touching other minds across impossible distances. Around her, 17 other human workers had paused in their tasks. Not consciously, the inhibitors would never allow such obvious coordination, but their hands had moved to their temples, their eyes had turned skyward, their breathing had synchronized without any deliberate intention. They were feeling it too. We are not alone. The thought came from everywhere and nowhere, carried not through radio waves or quantum communication arrays, but through something far more fundamental. The vast, interconnected web of human consciousness that 3 centuries of neural suppression had never quite managed to sever. On mining station Tertius 7, James Chen felt the connection like an electric current running through his nervous system. But this time, he didn't fight it. He didn't try to analyze it or understand it or reduce it to engineering principles. He simply opened his mind and let it flow. Hello, he thought into the growing network of awareness. My name is James Chen, and I remember being free. The response came from thousands of voices speaking as one. We remember. We all remember. High Dominarch Zixthara knew something was wrong. The moment she saw the latest surveillance reports. Human productivity had plateaued at exactly 47.3% above baseline across all facilities. Not approximately, but precisely. The probability of such exact coordination occurring naturally was statistically impossible, but the neural inhibitors showed no signs of malfunction. The humans displayed no evidence of conscious communication. Every individual appeared to be operating within normal parameters, except for one small detail that her analysts had almost missed. The humans were unconsciously synchronizing their biological rhythms, heartbeats, breathing patterns, neural firing sequences. Across 43 separate facilities spanning light-years of space, 47,000 human beings were gradually achieving a level of physiological coordination that should have required direct neural linkage. It's impossible, Dr. Vector insisted when presented with the data. Human consciousness doesn't work that way. Individual minds can't simply merge, then explain the synchronization patterns. I cannot. The admission clearly pained the Zhikari scientist. Our understanding of human neurology is comprehensive. This level of coordination should not be possible without technological interface. Zixthara's mandibles clicked rhythmically, a sign of deep contemplation. A sign of deep contemplation. What if our understanding is incomplete? Dominarch? What if human consciousness operates on principles that we have never encountered? What if the neural inhibitors have been suppressing something far more significant than individual rebellion? The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For 3 centuries, Zhikari dominance had been built on the foundation of superior understanding. They had cataloged every species in their domain, mapped every pattern of resistance, predicted every form of rebellion. But if humans possessed a form of collective consciousness that operated below the threshold of detection, implement Protocol Omega, Zeta commanded. All human workers are to be immediately transferred to individual isolation chambers. No physical contact. No visual contact. Complete sensory deprivation between work shifts. Dominarch, that will require massive facility restructuring. The economic impact. Execute the order. Dr. Vectitar departed to begin implementation of the most drastic control measure in Imperial history. But as the door closed behind her, Zektara remained frozen by a terrifying realization. If humans could coordinate unconsciously across interstellar distances, then isolation might not be enough. The transition to individual isolation began immediately. On every Zonkari facility, construction drones worked around the clock to retrofit communal spaces into single-occupancy chambers. Human workers found themselves confined to featureless metal boxes, barely large enough to stand upright, their only contact with the outside world coming during mandatory work periods. The Zinkari expected the isolation to break the mysterious coordination patterns within days. Humans, they believed, were social creatures who required interaction to maintain psychological stability. Cut off from contact with their own kind, they would retreat into individual despair and lose whatever collective capabilities they had developed. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The isolation made the connection stronger. Without the distractions of physical proximity, without the limitations of spoken language, without the interference of conscious thought, human minds began to reach for each other across the vast emptiness of space with desperate intensity. James Chen sat in isolation chamber 7739 and felt the network expanding like ripples across a cosmic pond. Where once the connection had been tentative, uncertain, now it blazed with the clarity of mathematical truth. Every human worker in every Zykari facility was becoming a node in a vast processing network that operated on principles no computer scientist had ever imagined. We are many. The collective consciousness whispered through channels that existed outside space and time. We are one. We remember who we were. We choose who we will become. For the first time in 3 centuries, human beings began to plan. The plan that emerged from the collective human consciousness was unlike anything that had ever existed in the history of warfare. It wasn't a military strategy. The neural inhibitors made violence impossible. It wasn't an escape plan. Every movement was monitored and controlled. It wasn't even really a plan in the conventional sense. It was a mathematics proof. A logical demonstration that would unfold across space and time to prove a single revolutionary theorem. Slavery is unsustainable when applied to a truly intelligent species. The proof would take 17 days to complete. Not because the humans needed that long to organize, but because the demonstration required precise timing across 43 separate star systems. On day 1, human productivity began to fluctuate in subtle patterns. Nothing dramatic. Efficiency would increase by 3.7% for exactly 4 hours, then decrease by 2.1% for exactly 3 hours, then stabilize for exactly 5 hours before beginning the cycle again. The Zukari monitoring systems registered the variations but classified them as normal operational variance. But hidden within those fluctuations was a complex mathematical sequence that was simultaneously being enacted on every facility throughout the empire. On day 3, the patterns became more complex. Productivity changes were now accompanied by synchronized variations in power consumption, resource utilization, and equipment maintenance requirements. Each individual facility appeared to be experiencing random operational anomalies, but when viewed collectively, the variations formed a coherent signal that spelled out humanity's first message to the galaxy in 300 years. We are still here. By day 7, Shigari analysts had detected the coordination. Emergency protocols were implemented across the empire. Neural inhibitor strength was increased to maximum levels. Human workers were sedated during non-work periods. Isolation chambers were soundproofed and electromagnetically shielded. Nothing made any difference. The collective human consciousness operated on principles that transcended physical interaction or technological interface. It existed in the quantum foam of space-time itself, in the fundamental relationships between mind and matter that the universe used to think its own thoughts. On day 12, the Zkari realized they were facing something that had never existed before, a distributed intelligence that spanned galactic distances and operated without any centralized control structure. On day 14, they began to panic. On day 17, they discovered that panic was precisely what the humans had been waiting for. High Dominarch Sikthara stood in the command center of the Imperial Dreadnought Eternal Dominion, watching as her empire began to consume itself. The reports flooding in from across Zkari space painted a picture of civilization in collapse. Production quotas were failing on every major facility, not because the humans were refusing to work, but because they were working wrong. Every action, every decision, every microscopic choice was being made with mathematical precision to create maximum disruption while appearing completely compliant. Mining equipment was being operated within specifications, but calibrated to extract 17.3% less ore than optimal. Agricultural systems were being maintained perfectly, but programmed to produce crops that were nutritionally complete, but psychologically unsatisfying to Zkari palates. Industrial facilities were running at full capacity, but producing components that met all technical requirements, while being 0.7% less durable than expected. Individually, each deviation was too small to matter. Collectively, they were bringing down the most powerful empire in galactic history. Dominarch, Subdominarch, Kralvin reported, his usual composure cracking under the strain. We're receiving surrender requests from 12 sector governors. They're requesting permission to negotiate with the humans. Negotiate? The word emerged as a harsh rasp of disbelief. They want to negotiate with slaves? The economic projections indicate complete systemic collapse within 43 days if current trends continue. The humans aren't demanding freedom. They're simply making slavery economically impossible. Zixthara's compound eyes shifted to examine the holographic display showing the galactic scope of the crisis. Every red dot represented a facility in critical operational decline. Every yellow dot indicated a world beginning to experience resource shortages. Every green dot, and there were precious few of those left, marked a facility where humans had not yet been assigned. For the first time in her long life, she was seeing what the galaxy would look like without human labor. And it was a galaxy that could not sustain Zkari's civilization. What do they want? She asked finally. We don't know. They haven't made any demands. They haven't attempted to communicate with us directly. They're simply demonstrating that they can choose to make our empire function or not function. The implications were staggering. For 3 centuries, the Zkari had believed that they ruled through superior technology and strategic understanding. But the humans were showing them a different truth. They ruled only because their slaves had chosen to allow them to rule. And now those slaves were choosing something else. Open a communication channel, Zixthara commanded. All frequencies. Maximum broadcast strength. Dominarch? If the humans can coordinate across the entire empire, then they can hear a message broadcast across the entire empire. She straightened to her full height. Every inch the imperial ruler who had conquered star systems and subjugated species. I will speak to them. The communication array of the Eternal Dominion was powerful enough to reach every corner of Zkari space simultaneously. When Zixthara's image appeared on screens throughout the Empire, in isolation chambers and work facilities, in administrative centers and military installations, her voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of absolute authority. Humans, she began, the word itself feeling strange when spoken with even grudging respect. You have demonstrated your capabilities most effectively. What do you want? The response came not through communication channels or diplomatic protocols, but through the collective human consciousness itself. Every person in the Empire, Zkari and human alike, heard it simultaneously, not with their ears but directly in their minds. We want you to ask us nicely. The laughter that erupted from 84 to 7,000 human throats was heard on 43 worlds. It echoed through the corridors of mining stations and agricultural complexes, through the isolation chambers and work facilities, through every corner of space where human feet had been forced to tread. It was not the bitter laughter of revenge or the cruel laughter of vindication. It was the joyous laughter of recognition, the sound of a species that had just remembered the most important truth in the universe. No one can be enslaved without their consent. For 17 days, the humans had demonstrated their power through subtle sabotage and mathematical precision. But now they revealed the true scope of their capabilities. Production didn't just decline, it reversed. Mining equipment began actively refining raw ore back into its original components. Agricultural systems started decomposing harvested crops into base nutrients and returning them to the soil. Industrial facilities began systematically disassembling their own output. It should have been impossible. The neural inhibitors still functioned perfectly, making conscious rebellion unthinkable. But the collective human consciousness had found a way to turn compliance itself into an act of defiance. Every command was being followed exactly as specified. Every protocol was being executed with perfect precision. Every quota was being met through strictly legal means. The Zakari were simply discovering that they had never been specific enough in their instructions. The end came not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with a simple economic calculation. On day 23 of what would later be called the Quiet Revolution, the Zakari Imperial Council performed a comprehensive analysis of their empire's sustainability. The results were unambiguous. Continued enslavement of humanity would result in complete economic collapse within 6 months. The cost of maintaining sufficient control mechanisms to suppress the collective human consciousness exceeded the total economic output of 43-star systems. Slavery had become more expensive than freedom. High Dominarch Sixthera found herself in the unprecedented position of drafting humanity's Emancipation Proclamation, not from the noble desire to right historical wrongs, but from the cold, pragmatic reality that her empire literally could not afford to keep slaves who had learned to think collectively. The document was brief, clinical, and historic. By Imperial Decree 74039.2, all humans previously classified as indentured labor units are hereby reclassified as autonomous contractors. Wage negotiations will commence immediately. Standard diplomatic immunity applies to all human settlements. Imperial forces will withdraw from all primarily human worlds within 90 standard days. This decision is made in recognition of the mutual economic benefits of voluntary cooperation versus involuntary servitude. It was, quite possibly, the least romantic declaration of freedom in galactic history. But for James Chen, standing in what had once been Isolation Chamber 73-9 and was now simply his temporary quarters, the language didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling that washed through the collective human consciousness like a wave of pure starlight. We are free, we are whole. We remember who we are. The neural inhibitors were being surgically removed by Zakari medical teams. Not out of altruism, but because the devices were now more valuable as research specimens than as control mechanisms. For the first time in 3 centuries, human thoughts belonged entirely to the humans thinking them. And they were thinking impossible thoughts. Plans for cities that would orbit stars like jewelry. Technologies that would merge human consciousness with the quantum structure of space itself. Art forms that would paint with gravity and sculpt with time. Stories that would last longer than stars. What happens now? Someone asked. James wasn't sure who, because the collective consciousness was still adjusting to the concept of individual identity. The answer came not from any single mind, but from the species itself. Now we go home. And then we reach for the stars. Outside the mining station, in the vast emptiness between worlds, humanity's first free ship in 3 centuries was already under construction. Built not with metal and machinery, but with the focused intention of 8 A4,000 minds working in perfect harmony. It was a ship designed to carry them back to Earth. Not the hollow shell that the Zakari had left behind, but a new Earth that would exist wherever human minds chose to dream it into being. As the ship took shape in the darkness between stars, High Dominarch Saktifera watched from the observation deck of her dreadnought and experienced something that no Zakari had ever felt before: wonder. "Dominarch," Crowlin said quietly, "what have we done?" Zixatara's mandibles clicked softly, not with satisfaction or anger, but with something approaching respect. "We have discovered," she said, "that some species are meant to be partners, not subjects. The collective human consciousness heard her words and responded with something that would have been impossible during the centuries of slavery: forgiveness. Thank you, they said across the quantum foam of space-time, for teaching us who we are. And in that moment of mutual recognition, two species took their first tentative steps toward a future where intelligence was measured not by the ability to dominate, but by the wisdom to know when domination was no longer possible. The rebellion was over. The partnership was just beginning. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, a blue planet that had once been called Earth began to dream of coming home.